Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Rachel Patton, Executive Director of Preserve Arkansas and President-elect of the Arkansas Historical Association. Welcome to the final virtual session of the AHA's 81st Annual Conference, The Queer World of Charles J. Finger by Elizabeth Findley Shores. A couple housekeeping items, which you probably are all aware of by now if you've been watching the conference sessions, but just for your information, the session is being recorded and it will be available at a later date on the AHA's YouTube channel. Please post your questions and comments for Elizabeth in either the chat or the Q&A, and she will get to those at the end of her presentation. And when you leave the webinar, even if you don't make it to the end, if you hit leave, it will pop up a survey in a new window. Please take a couple seconds to complete that survey. It helps us with our grant reporting and helps us to improve the conference each year. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Findley Shores. Elizabeth is a past trustee of the Arkansas Historical Association and was the program chair for the association's conference in 2002. She grew up in Alabama and received an undergraduate degree in American Civilization with a minor in African Studies from Boston University. She holds the Master of Public History from UALR. She came to Arkansas in 1979 as part of a small cohort of young reporters and editors hired by the Arkansas Democrat when it launched a morning edition to go head-to-head with the Arkansas Gazette. She worked for the Democrat for 2 years, managing to be fired twice by the infamous editor John Robert Starr, and for the Log Cabin Democrat in Conway for 1 year. She also was fired at the Log Cabin. After that, she began a 29-year career as a writer, editor, and researcher for publications and governmental and non-governmental organizations, everything from the Department of Arkansas Heritage to the USDA Forest Service to the international rescue organization Save the Children. As a writer for the Arkansas Peace Center in 1983, she received a Barefoot and Pregnant Award from the Arkansas Women's Political Caucus at the event depicted on this year's conference program for being literally barefoot and pregnant. In her last position as Senior Research Associate for the Mississippi State University Early Childhood Institute, she was closely involved in restoration of the child care sector following Hurricane Katrina. And she spearheaded the use of geographic information systems to assess disaster risk in the child care sector nationwide. In 2011, Elizabeth began writing full-time. She has had 3 biographies published by university presses and is now at work on a biography of William Woodruff, founder of the Arkansas Gazette. Her work has been called, quote, important, illuminating, and a revelation. She is going to talk with us tonight about her 2021 book, published by the University of Arkansas Press, called Shared Secrets, The Queer World of Newbery Medalist Charles J. Finger. Elizabeth, I'll turn it over to you now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
all good.
And Rachel, congratulations on your election as president of the AHA. And thank you from the bottom of my heart to you and to Heather Zabindin for saving me this afternoon when we were having those minor technical problems. Can't thank you enough. I want to also thank Professor Kelly Houston Jones and Donna Ludlow for all the work they've done to put together this conference. And I want to recognize a few of the earlier speakers this week. Dina Owens for her presentation on the challenges of research in queer history. Tamala Tenpenny Lewis for her talk on the invisible life of another queer writer in Arkansas. Todd Lewis for his profile of Ralph Hyman. Professor John Kirk for his intriguing introduction to the New York side of Winthrop Rockefeller, and Tim Nutt for his equally interesting introduction to Harvey Donegan of Warren, who found his true home in New York. And that feels like sort of a theme of the meeting, since my paper's subject, Charles Finger, also felt more at home in New York than he did in Arkansas. I want to mention that I'm indebted to the University of Arkansas Special Collections, and particularly the former director, Tim Nutt, as well as Joshua Youngblood and Jeffrey Stark. The Special Collections Library is the keeper of the Finger papers, and I'm sorry that I couldn't tune in for Mr. Stark's presentation yesterday. I'm grateful to Rob Leffler and Charles Leffler of Fayetteville for allowing me to spend time at Finger's house and spend time with his books. And I try to always thank the Central Arkansas Library System's Interlibrary Loan Department. As an independent scholar, I couldn't do what I do without ILL, because they are able to borrow books for me from libraries around the country. My greatest debt is to the University of Arkansas Press, and I want to give a shout out to April Ledig, who designed the beautiful cover that you see here. And then thanks to all of you for tuning in tonight, and I hope you enjoy it. What I'm planning to do is talk to you a little bit about how it happened that I focused on Finger's life as a closeted gay man, a little detail about his life, including a couple of small mysteries that I failed to solve. I'm going to read a few passages from Finger's work and a few from my book. And I'm going to talk about Finger's significance in the history of queer literature, and a little bit about what I consider his greatest moral lapse. I didn't set out to write a biography of a closeted gay man. In fact, I didn't realize Finger was queer until I'd been working on the research for a year or more, and I was reading his memoir for the second time. Uh-oh. There we go. And I had an aha moment when I discovered a passage that I realized was rather homoerotic. Finger was describing how he accepted an invitation for a sailing trip in the Canary Islands. In reality, his stop in the islands was quite brief, and I don't think he went sailing there. Rather, he was recalling sailing trips in the Strait of Magellan with a friend named Ernest Schumacher. The passage was not just a nod of remembrance to one former lover, but to two, because in the memoir, he gave the sailboat the name Ferdinand, like a friend he made in Texas, Ferdinand Habercorn. As Finger told this fictitious story, he met the man with the sailboat in a bar, and the barkeeper encouraged him to accept the man's sailing invitation. It would be a wonderful romance, the innkeeper said. We could sail for an hour, a day, a week, and the heart would fly. And so Finger accepted the invitation. He wrote in the memoir, the little craft rose and fell on the gentle swell and looked like a sensitive living thing. You could see that its owner had lavished upon it all the care that a youth gives to his sweetheart. The mast had been polished and varnished. The red and white striped sails were neatly lashed. The little cabin with ports no larger than saucers was a jewel of brightness. Finger used an image that appears throughout his work of a man bravely climbing to a cliff's edge and there beholding a beautiful but terrifying sight. Quote, we sailed about the islands. At Tenerife, I climbed the mountain to look down at Punta Rasca and found myself at a precipitous place. He had to go sideways with my back against the rock and my hands outspread, feeling my way until the path broadened. I found myself highly desirous of taking the new way. I was afraid, nervous, and fearful of what might happen, not daring to look at anything but the azure sea. He made it down the cliff and back to the boat, next employing an image of lying on the deck and looking up to the sky, another image that appears throughout his work. Quote, the little craft flew over the sunlit waters as light as a hummingbird. For me, it was a perfect fullness of life to be at the tiller and feel the ship answer every little movement, to see the foam streaming past, to hear the music of rushing water, to feel the boat rise on a wave, the curve of the sail, the green and white wake, the curl of the waves, the rhythm of the motion, the gulls and curlews that played about us, the fish that leaped and raced, the light noise that was the song of the ship. These filled me with a joy that is not to be written about. The song of the ship, was a subtle allusion to Walt Whitman's poems, Song of the Open Road and Song of Myself. And that joy was a reference to Oscar Wilde's famous line, the love that dare not speak its name. Finger concluded, for the sheer pleasure of it, we ran all night. Once I deciphered this passage, Finger's story became much more interesting to me. As a biographer, I like stories about people whose lives have been overlooked or misunderstood. The fact that they were obscure or have become obscure makes the research a lot more fun. Many history lovers in Arkansas know two things about Finger. He lived in Fayetteville, and he was a recipient of the Newbery Medal for Children's Literature. Or maybe three things: Fayetteville, Newbery, and he was British. In the years before and since he died, there's been a lot of confusing misinformation about how he wound up in Arkansas. And that was due in large part to Finger's own lifelong disinformation campaign, false information that he repeated about everything from the year of his birth to what he did in Chile to the nature of his friendships with men. Here are a few true facts about Finger. He was born in London in 1867. His family was lower middle class and lacked the means for him to obtain much formal education. His love of books began during his childhood when he read the cheap books for children known as penny dreadfuls. And those were stories that typically involved boys who escaped society and the oversight of women. His formative or most formative experience was as a member of the Regent Street Polytechnic Institute in London. The Poly was a combination of trade school and massive social club with a profoundly homosocial atmosphere. This was during a period of escalating intimidation of gay men in London. And so Finger and several of his adventurous friends fled that very risky scene in 1890 for jobs on a steamship that transported coal to Chile. He spent the next 6 years in Patagonia, acquiring a variety of skills and getting to know a wide variety of men. In 1896, he joined his birth family in New York City, but felt extreme pressure to get married and fled again, this time hoping to catch up with a Texas sheep rancher he had met. He wound up in San Angelo, Texas, worked on sheep ranches and as a writer for weekly newspapers. The concept of duality first appeared in Finger's work when he was in San Angelo, and he created the persona or alter ego of Jack Random. He wrote newspaper columns under that pseudonym, and in the first, he described Jack Random, that is to say himself, sitting beside a stove in a bar, reading my Walt Whitman. That line was like a neon sign saying hello to any gay men who happened to pick up the newspaper. While Finger was in San Angelo, he accidentally got his employer's daughter, Eleanor Ferguson, pregnant and married her in the nick of time. They had 5 children, and he worked for about 20 years in the railroad industry to support his family. They wound up in Ohio. This was the first house they had in Ohio, and as you can see, it was probably very crowded for a family with 4 or 5 children. All during these years, Finger engaged in a self-guided education as a writer. And I was able to trace his reading by making an inventory of the books that survived at his house in Fayetteville. And here you see a set of shelves built, I think, by his grandson, Rob Leffler, as almost like a shrine. There's a portrait of Finger hanging there in the middle. And these are almost all of the books that Finger owned at the time he died. So I did a methodical inventory. Here is where I worked at the Leffler's kitchen table, stack of books to my left. And what I found was that Finger read widely in 3 main categories: classic and recent British, American, and European literature, leftist political works, some focused on gay and lesbian identity, and travel and adventure, works by Joseph Conrad and W.H. Hudson, for example. I call chapter 4 Finger's Library in acknowledgement of a critical work in the history of queer literature by a scholar named James Gifford. The title is Daneford's Library, American Homosexual Writing, 1900 to 1914. Many of the books that Finger read fit in 2 or all 3 of those categories. works by Jack London, for example. And one of the ideas that runs through Shared Secrets is that London was a significant influence on Finger. His pseudonym, of course, Jack Random, was in part an homage to London's name and partly an allusion to the picaresque novel Roderick Random by Tobias Smollett, which was one of the first recognized works in the history of queer fiction. Finger created his farm in Arkansas in the image of Beauty Ranch, London's California home. Both houses had libraries in the center of the house, sleeping porches, and other features in common. A trip that Finger made to see London's good friend George Sterling is one of the episodes I had the most fun researching. Sterling was one of the early supporters of Finger's literary magazine, All's Well, so they were frequent correspondents. Finger had gone to Seattle to accept the Newbery Medal, and from there went down to San Francisco to meet Sterling in person. When he visited him, Sterling was in the advanced stage of alcoholism and had recently been hospitalized, but they spent a long night visiting different writers and roaming around. One of the stops they made was at a house called Flowering Wall, which was the home of the poet C.E.S. Wood. And this is a bit from Shared Secrets about that evening. Leaving Flowering Wall, Finger and Sterling resumed their meander through the San Francisco night as Sterling reminisced about his own first guide to the city's nightlife, Jack London. They had enjoyed talking about socialism and drinking to excess and even tried hashish together. London and his wife, Charmian, often had picnics with George and Carrie Sterling and other bohemian friends. Sterling became London's editor, encouraging a rhythmic, rhyming, expressive voice. He posed in the nude for London to photograph. London called him the Greek, and Sterling called London Wolf, the same endearment that Charmian used for him. London wrote an erotic poem, unpublished during his life, about Sterling as a godlike man who, quote, ran his finger underneath the edge, close quote, of a flower bud and unfolded it. Sterling was London's great man comrade who loved the flesh as he should the spirit. And by the time this short day and a half together ended, Sterling had formed an impression of Finger as such an important literary descendant of London that he gave to Finger this death mask of London that was his own possession. Sterling committed suicide a year later. So at the end of this long self-guided education as a writer, Finger and his family lived in a suburb of Cincinnati, and he was breaking into writing for the many weekly and monthly periodicals that were crucial entertainment media for middle-brow readers at the time. And this was when things became exciting. It was 1919, and Finger was 52 years old. An editor in St. Louis, William Marion Reedy, published an eclectic weekly news magazine called Reedy's Mirror that had a national circulation. Reedy published a few short things by Finger and gave him valuable feedback on one of his first attempts at fiction. He published Finger's short story, Canassa, in October 1919. And then Reedy did something extraordinary. He recommended Finger to Henry Louis Mencken, the editor of the highly sophisticated magazine, The Smart Set. Mencken published 3 of Finger's stories. Reedy published more, and those short stories were very much part of the queer canon of the time, suggestive, veiled, and packed with allusions to other queer writers. I make my case for this idea in a chapter I call Daring Discourse. The story Ebro, which appeared in Reedy's Mirror, was probably Finger's greatest realization of his literary method, that is, merging material from his years in Patagonia with intensively elusive characters and situations. Ebro was so interesting at the time that it even became material for gossip among writers in England. In the biography, I kind of stretch out in my discussion of Ebro, explicating it in more detail than any of Finger's other works, except his memoir. A female character in the story is the narrator's sexual partner, and the narrator gives her a name that, as far as we know, Finger pronounced galleta, like the Spanish word for cookie. But he spelled it this way. The connotation that we know of the word gay was not yet familiar to the general public, but it was in use in the queer world. So this was a bit of wordplay, with Finger signaling to queer readers that the story was quasi-autobiographical and the sexual partner was really a man. In 1920, Reedy asked Finger to come to St. Louis and fill in for him, putting out the Mirror, while Reedy covered the Democratic National Convention in San Francisco. Unfortunately, Reedy died while he was in San Francisco. Finger was devastated, but put out a few more issues of the Mirror, hoping he could somehow take it over permanently. However, he had no money to put into the business, and Reedy's widow shut it down. So Finger went from being an up-and-coming fiction writer and editor with a national profile to a man with no job and a wife, 5 children, a father-in-law, a sister-in-law, a live-in maid, and a herd of sheep, all waiting for him to show up at the farm that his father-in-law had bought on the side of Mount Kessler in Fayetteville. Finger lived about 20 more years, naming the Fayetteville farm Guyetta and promoting it as an art colony. Here is a picture of the house as it looked a few years ago. And as you can see, the Ripley house was a model for it. Someone commented on this during this conference on Monday, I think, that Guyetta is a historic site that could be preserved as a site of gay history in Arkansas. And that's an interesting idea, but it is a private residence that's still in the Finger family. Here we see Finger with one of his sons and his friend Murray Sheehan, who was a journalism professor at the university at the time, and they became friends. Here we see another of the Finger sons with some of the sheep. And this is a portrait that the art photographer J.H. Field of Fayetteville made of Finger. So Finger launched an idiosyncratic little magazine that he called All's Well. He became a famous writer of books for children. He developed a wide circle of friends from around the country who were artists, musicians, and other writers, many of whom visited Guyetta. But he was always living for the next chance to take a trip away from Arkansas to see his friend, George Washington Maddox. Thanks. I just need to be able to see that. Finger probably met Maddox during the St. Louis interlude. Maddox was a high-ranking army officer who served in France in World War I. He loved poetry and fiction, and after he returned to the US, he sometimes wrote to writers and editors whom he admired. I speculate that he sent a fan letter to Finger after reading one of Finger's short stories. He was stationed at Camp Zachary Taylor in Louisville, and they arranged to meet in person in St. Louis. From that time on, Finger lived largely for the next rendezvous with George. He often shared with his readers that he was meeting up with his lover, never identifying him, of course, and writing in a veiled fashion that was opaque to most straight readers, but crystal clear to gay and lesbian readers. For example, when Maddox wrote to Finger in 1923 to ask him to join him on a road trip, Finger quoted the letter in All's Well. "Indulge yourself in lazy contentment," Maddox wrote to Finger. "Let the sheep bleat, the cows low, the horses neigh, the hens cackle, the birds chorus, the children play hooky. Take a last look at those purple hills of yours. Wave a goodbye to the oaks and hickories. Pack the bag. Salute the wife and kiddies. We are off, you and I, on the open road. Meet me at Louisville on your way to Columbus, at the races, and then hi-ho for whatever road opens before us." Finger added a comment. "The man has a way with him. So glory be, the fates permitting, I'll be there with loins girded and staff in hand. I think that had he called on me to go a-hunting with sharpened flints, if he had called on me to sail once more those leaping seas where once I sailed, I would go. Give me a friend and a day and some breezy hilltop, and I ask no fairer thing. So I find myself in a mood of delight because of remembered happiness. I've wired, I'll be there." Some of their meetings were on the Gulf Coast in Mississippi, where George's sister was the dean of a private college for women. And this is a short bit from Shared Secrets. "Being with Maddox in Mississippi inspired Finger to write a passage packed with sensory impressions. An air of peace pervaded the entire countryside. he wrote. The Gulf was a sweep of pale blue, here alive with flashing white seagulls, there hardly to be distinguished from horizon haze. Sometimes quite close to shore, so close that you may hear the voices of the men and the creaking of blocks. You see a fishing schooner, beautiful with bellying sail of brown or white, though the wind is hardly strong enough to ripple the water. Finger's account of this visit was vivid, yet vague, meandering in sequence and location, like one of the wide, slow rivers on the coastal plain. At Biloxi, he and Maddox climbed steep stairs to the top of a tower, probably the Biloxi Lighthouse, and heard the murmur of the sea. Lighthouses could represent, as the scholar Holly Furneaux put it, interstitial spaces of imaginative possibility. And Finger had made the narrator of one of his other short stories, A Lightkeeper, looking at tall ships in the harbor and the shimmering, winking waves. Finger, quote, was ablaze with a desire that things which had been might be again, he wrote. His phrase is colorfully suggestive. And while my companion talked, in me was a memory of tropic nights and of scented winds and of the lullaby of lapping waters and the strange green fires of the sea and a morning sun that leaped out of the ocean at the end of a lane of flowing gold. In 1930, Finger visited Maddox's hobby ranch, in Arizona, which Maddox called Golden Days. My husband and I went to Arizona, and I wrote these lines about the scenery that Finger admired. The landscape at Maddox's ranch reminded Finger of Tierra del Fuego. The sun rising over the Arizona plain gradually lightened the terrain of muted browns, greens, and grays, slowly bringing the strong limbs of the acacia trees into relief. The scarlet throats of hummingbirds, darting from flower to flower, flashed like a gaucho's satin-lined cape. After the sunset at the far rim of the vast, sweeping, quiet night, the stars seemed to flicker like a lover, winking from across a room, a country, the years. It was a place of health and activity and freedom, Finger told the readers of All's Well. A man could drift to eternity in such conditions. And while they were in Arizona, they made a side trip to Nogales, Mexico. And Finger also described some of the bars they ducked in. There are a couple of pictures I found of Nogales at an archive in Tucson. Finger and Maddox had a wide circle of mutual friends, some of whom became crucial collaborators and supporters. The painter and printmaker Paul Honoré illustrated several of Finger's books and sometimes traveled with him and visited Guyetta at least once, painting several of the doors in the house. That's one of the doors. The editor, Robert Hobart Davis, was extraordinarily influential. One of the first magazine editors to publish Joseph Conrad, for example, a syndicated newspaper columnist, a portrait photographer who published a stunning book of portraits with the coded title, Man Makes His Own Mask. He included a portrait of Finger in that book, but not one of Maddox, who remained closeted throughout his life. Davis was the main link for Finger and Maddox to the entire bohemian intelligentsia of New York City, and they enjoyed a rather star-studded social life during Finger's more or less annual trips there. One of the small mysteries that I failed to solve is about a party that the writer Carl Van Vechten gave in New York in 1923. I found in the university archive a short note that Van Vechten wrote to the novelist Theodore Dreiser, inviting Dreiser to drop in at Van Vechten's apartment for a party on October 27th. I determined that Finger was in New York at that time and visited Dreiser, who was working on his novel, An American Tragedy. And Dreiser went to the Van Vechten party. So I surmised that Dreiser invited Finger to meet him at the party and gave the note to Finger because it had Van Vechten's address on it. With this as my lead, I plunged into the world of Van Vechten. His novel, Blind Bow Boy, was just out. Finger had a copy. Here's a photo that I made of one of the plates in Finger's copy. And here's a detail showing the nude archer. The image of a naked archer is a classic motif excuse me, in gay art and literature. And in fact, J.H. Field, the photographer in Fayetteville, made a photograph using Finger's son Hubert as his model. Finger referred to Van Vechten in the next issue of All's Well in a manner that suggested that they met. He wrote that Van Vechten was hot on the triumph of Peter Whiffle, his previous novel, and now comes with The Blind Bow Boy. And Van Vechten, everyone should know, is always amusing and interesting with his odd people and strange places and moving events. I found an excerpt of Van Vechten's diary in which he listed the people who came to that party, including two of the three famous Stettheimer sisters, Carrie and Etty. The third sister, Florine, was not there, but in learning about her work as a painter, I found a portrait that she made of Van Vechten in the apartment about a year earlier. So I had an idea of what Finger saw if he went to the party. And in case you're curious, there's a new biography of Florine Stettheimer. The New Yorker reviewed it recently. I found fascinating material about many of the guests at the party. Etty Stettheimer had just had a novel, Love Days, published under a pseudonym, and another of the guests, Robert Morse Lovett, subsequently wrote a rave review of her book for the New Republic. The photographer Nicholas Murray, who was one of Frida Kahlo's lovers, was there. In fact, this party was rich enough to be the springboard for an entire book, or at least a chapter. But ultimately, I left this party out of my book because Van Vechten didn't mention Finger as one of the guests in the published version of his diary. The editor of the diary inserted ellipses, so it's possible that he omitted Finger from Van Vechten's list of guests. But I couldn't manage a trip to New York to examine the original diary in the New York Public Library. Nonetheless, I think Finger went to the party with Dreiser and Van Vechten, just didn't bother to mention him in the diary entry. Finger had not yet received the Newbery Medal, and so he was not yet a celebrity. I can't talk about Finger without acknowledging the thing that made him famous, that in 1925, he was the fourth recipient of the Newbery Medal, an annual prize given by the American Library Association for his book, Tales from Silver Lands. And this is a rather bad news photograph of him accepting the award at a ceremony in Seattle. I think there are two important things about Finger's Newbery Award. First, the choice of Finger was in large part the effort of two highly influential women in American publishing. The first was Mae Massey, his editor at Doubleday, whom Finger met thanks to their mutual friend, Carl Sandburg. The other was Anne Carroll Moore, one of the members of the Library Association's selection committee. Moore fell in love with Silverlands when she saw the book in galleys. The other important point is that receiving the Newbery spelled the end of Finger's career as a serious writer of adult fiction. He had spent the first 50 years of his life in London, on ranches, working on railroads, wishing he could be a writer, despite a lack of formal education and despite the pressure to support a large family. Then he spent about 5 years working seriously and very hard on fiction in one particular genre, exotic adventure stories for adults. He was breaking into the big time with short stories published in Minkins magazine and other prestigious but low-paying little magazines when he accepted the commission from Massey to write Silverlands simply to make some money. Winning the Newbery made him a genuine star on the book pages of newspapers around the country, and back then that was huge. It transformed him into a fatherly figure in American children's literature. He was bombarded with contract offers from major publishers to write more books for children. Here's the tragedy. In that limelight, it was hardly possible for Finger to continue writing queer short stories for magazines. In other words, his success with Silverlands meant his death as a writer for adults. So why is Charles Finger's life interesting today? The most important point about Finger, in my opinion, is that he creatively used mainstream media as what we would call a virtual social network. To understand that, we have to consider how important clubs were to Finger. Throughout his life, the only place in the world where he felt safe to be out as a gay man was in occasional encounters with other ranch hands and horse traders in Patagonia. Everywhere else, he had to find hiding places where queer men could see each other in secret. Gentlemen's clubs in London were Finger's introduction to the idea of the private invitation-only club for men, and he organized men's clubs everywhere he lived. The first was a literary society at the Regent Street Polytechnic Institute, but he also started bars or clubs in South America, in Texas, in New Mexico, in Ohio. And when he moved to Arkansas, he envisioned Guyetta as an art colony, that is, a retreat center of a sort for his guests. Art colonies were a phenomenon in the US that was not strictly for queer getaways, but typically they were open to gender diversity among artists. Finger's dream of Guyetta as an art colony did not really come about, but the stops, usually brief, that many celebrities made at the farm became the main element of the legend of Finger in Fayetteville. And this is a stone cottage that he built uphill from the main house, originally as a residence for his friend Murray Sheehan, but later he used it for many of the guests who stopped at Guyetta. George Maddox spent significant amounts of time here. Finger and Maddox and Bob Davis and a few other men in New York formed a jokey, secret, highly selective club called the New Face Club. Finger described one of their dinner parties as, quote, one of those happy-go-lucky man-conducted functions. The New Face Club was a particularly fun discovery, and it pained me that I only had room to give it one page in the book. Building on the importance of secret clubs to Finger and his friends, I suggest that he used popular periodicals as virtual meeting places for what he called his understanding friends. Writers, playwrights, columnists, and bibliophiles, almost exclusively men who exchanged ideas and messages and perhaps love notes. The readers of Finger's little magazine, All's Well, were what we might call the charter members of his club. He corresponded with some of his subscribers and visited some of them and invited them to visit him. He shared those veiled reports about his rendezvous with George with the readers of All's Well. And when he had to stop publishing that magazine because he could no longer afford it, he felt the loss of that circle of friends very deeply. But All's Well was by no means their only meeting place. During his main writing years, the book review pages of newspapers and magazines were a huge virtual world in which writers, playwrights, and illustrators circulated. And Finger wrote hundreds of book reviews. For Finger, they were the platform for a queer network. And speaking of love notes, another of the mysteries that I failed to solve is about George Maddox's poetry. Maddox became friends with the novelist Conrad Richter, who said in a letter to someone else in 1933 that Maddox had had poems published in the magazine The Atlantic. I couldn't find any poems under Maddox's name in The Atlantic or anywhere, but I did find these anonymous poems published in The Atlantic in 1927 that could reflect Maddox's romance with Finger. The title is Two Sonnets, and the opening lines of the first one are, when I am gone, and I shall go before you, think of me not as your disconsolate lover. Think of the joy it gave me to adore you. There are repeated references to songs that could allude to Whitman. The phrases sun and stars and burnished seas repeat the sailing motif that Finger used. And the phrase seams of ribald laughter reminds me of the racy jokes that Finger, Maddox, and their friends shared. If these are the poems Conrad Richter mentioned, they are a rare indication of Maddox's feeling for Finger because Finger destroyed all but one of George's letters to him at George's request. For my idea that Finger and his friends used periodicals as a virtual network, I'm principally indebted to two historians. First, Sarah E. Gardner of Mercer University. In her book, Reviewing the South in 2017, she characterized what she called the book review culture of the years between World War I and II as an ongoing conversation. And Natasha Hurley of the University of Alberta, who argued in 2018 in Circulating Queerness that, quote, through performative acts of reading and collection, books on the shelves frame and reframe each other, possessing an agency of their own. Collecting texts makes selves and worlds, close quote. Hurley characterized the recommending and sharing of books as, quote, discursive proliferation. I said at the beginning that I wanted to share with you something about what I consider a serious moral lapse on Finger's part. And by that, I don't mean the fact that he led a double life. I find him rather heroic for striving so hard to support his wife and large family, and for trying to leave a financial legacy for his wife, Nellie, after he was gone. This is Nellie on the right. By being prolific to a fault, he actually was able to some degree to do that. What I find objectionable is the way he betrayed his early literary allies and even engaged in the same kind of oppression that gay men and women experienced, but a kind of oppression that was even more serious at the time. The way this happened is that during the latter 1920s, Finger's most reliable freelance income was from the car manufacturer Henry Ford, because Ford published a monthly magazine, the Dearborn Independent. The editors of the Independent put a lot of pressure on Finger to write material on Ford's two obsessions: the supposed vulgarity of modern art and literature and anti-Semitism. Finger was extremely uncomfortable with this pressure, but he needed the money and he did what he was told, including criticizing Mencken repeatedly for publishing and promoting modern writers, even though Mencken had been Finger's greatest literary sponsor and extremely important to Finger's development as a writer of serious fiction. Finger's anti-Semitic writing was more limited, and he did try in a roundabout way to make amends for it later, but there it is. Considering that Finger was a writer of very modern literature himself, some of which Mencken published, and that Finger was himself part of an oppressed minority, his complicity with Henry Ford was, in my view, hypocritical, to say the least. I'm going to close with a passage from the end of the book that involves a visit to Guyetta by two Arkansas writers, John Gould Fletcher and Charlie Mae Simon. They had become good friends of the Finger family, and Simon was helping Finger's daughter Helen get work as an illustrator. This is from the chapter called The End of the Tale. The Finger family often listened to a radio that Maddox gave them one Christmas, and I compared radio listings in the Fayetteville newspaper and an edited collection of Edward Murrow's broadcast to put together the news reports that they heard. This period is particularly poignant because Finger deeply wanted to return to England one more time. This is a clipping that he saved of a drawing of Shepherd's Market in London. Let's see. England declared war against Germany in September 1939. On the radio, Edward R. Murrow reported from London each night, sometimes from rooftops as bombs fell around him. His updates were like a tour of Finger's England. This afternoon, he said, I spent 2 hours and a gallon of precious gasoline looking at London from Hampstead Heath, where Finger and Peer ambled on a romantic day in 1890, to St. Paul's, near the coffee houses and halls where the radicals gave speeches, to Fleet Street, the home of London's newspapers, and down the Strand, where Finger saw the gondoliers at the Savoy Theatre, to Trafalgar Square, the site of Cunningham Graham's stand. On New Year's Eve, Murrow delivered a message rather like Finger's annual greeting, but in a sorrowful, chilling context. The end of 1939 finds 1 million men are under arms in Britain. Homes have been broken up by evacuation, and tens of thousands of men and women are manning searchlights and anti-aircraft guns, fire engines, and ambulances. Finger became more depressed as Germany advanced upon England, and the Lord Privy Seal Clement Attlee told the House of Commons, as Murrow reported, we are free men fighting for our lives, and in order that we may fight more effectively, we must give up our freedom. During the Battle of Dunkirk, Murrow described a man in Regent Street with a sign that read, watch and pray. Murrow drove around southern England, through hop fields and between high hedges, the countryside where Finger took a great tramp in 1889. Prime Minister Winston Churchill told the House of Commons, "We shall go to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, in the hills. We shall never surrender." Finger could hardly bear to listen to war news on the radio. "It makes me sick," he wrote to Fletcher. Finger wasn't well. When Fletcher and Simon came for a visit in November 1940, his face was deeply lined, his hair thin and white, and his eyes tired. He had to lie down on the sofa to chat with them. The couple took him on a drive, and Finger surprised Fletcher by confessing that recently he had begun praying. He recited the Lord's Prayer in the car. The Fletchers departed on Armistice Day. Bidding them farewell, Finger asked in Spanish, "When shall we meet again?" 5 days later, a large bomb hit Shepherd Market in Mayfair, and fires broke out on the streets that were the settings of Finger's earliest memories. The Fayetteville newspaper reported that Southampton was engulfed in an ocean of flames. Bristol was bombed heavily and repeatedly. Hitler's promise, reported on December 10th, was to defeat the entire world. I go on to describe a letter that Finger received shortly after that from Maddox, but I won't read that part. I'll leave it as a surprise for any of you who decide to read the book. And now I'll thank you for joining me. And I want to thank the University of Arkansas Press again for publishing Shared Secrets.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
My
It's a fascinating story and tragic. You have a couple questions.
Super.
And I'll invite people to continue to type your questions. We've got plenty of time. This one is from Darren Bell. Is the Finger family reserved about his orientation or publicity? I was wondering if the family has ever been approached about the National Register or other criterion in recognition of Finger's life.
As for the National Register, that's a great question, and I don't know. I think that the living descendants of Charles Finger were not aware of this side of his life until after I began working on the book. And so that was actually a pretty sensitive matter, and I approached his two grandsons, Professor Rob Leffler and Professor Charles Leffler at the University of Arkansas, and shared with each of them the conclusion I had drawn. And I was delighted because they were delighted. They thought it made their grandfather more interesting, and I agree with that.
That's great. And another question from Charlie Bolton. Now that you've finished with this wonderful book, what's next?
Well, Professor Bolton actually knows very well that I have been working on a biography of William Woodruff, and it's been a bit slow. The pandemic didn't help, but I am very near completing a first draft. And in this book, I focus on Woodruff's actions as a slaveholder. In fact, the book has, I believe, 8 chapters that are profiles of individual enslaved persons who were in some way associated with Woodruff. So once again, I'm sort of looking at people who were obscure or on the margins of history.
Mm-hmm. I think that's wonderful. I can't wait to see that. I've got some questions, and people continue to type yours if you have them. I grew up in Farmington, so I'm familiar with Finger Park. Can you tell us a little bit about that, or what else do you know that we should know about his life in Fayetteville and in Arkansas?
I did not know that there's a Finger Park in Farmington, but I would suspect that it's named for Finger's brother, Emil Finger. And this is a fun fact. One of Finger's brothers, Emil, married one of Nellie's sisters, Amelia. And sometime during the Depression, they moved to Farmington to be closer to CJ and Nellie Finger. And they all sort of looked out for each other after that. And I think also that both Charles and Nellie Finger remains are buried in a cemetery in Farmington, along with Emil and Amelia.
Interesting. And this park is not in Farmington proper, it's in Fayetteville, but it's on the west,
okay.
on the west side.
Oh, yeah. Then, yeah, again, I'm not embarrassed to say, I don't know the origin of why that park was named for him. But there's also Finger Road, which goes up the mountain and leads past the property, which was much larger at the time he was raising sheep than it is now. In fact, folks in Fayetteville will know there's a gigantic Lowe's on the road to Farmington. And
Okay, yeah.
yeah, and that's Finger Road, and all of that property down at the bottom of the hill was part of Finger's farm originally.
Wow, okay, that's interesting. What about, can you talk a little bit more about the book that won the Newbery Medal?
Yeah, Tales from Silver Lands. So Mae Massey was the first editor for children's literature at Doubleday. And it was right after World War I. And she was entirely focused on the idea of promoting peace by fostering international understanding among American children. And her idea was to publish high quality children's books with international subjects. And she was interested in folk tales because she was very plugged into the read aloud experience for children, how teachers or librarians would read books aloud, and folk tales were short and very appropriate for read aloud sessions. So she came up with the idea of folk tales from someplace in South America. And she was bouncing this idea off Carl Sandburg. They had become friends when she lived in Chicago. Sandburg had gotten to know Finger. There's a long story there. And he recommended Finger to Massey. So she reached out to him, and I described this in some detail in the book, and commissioned this work. And so the folk tales were entirely invented, not authentic at all. But they were pretty engaging, and I think Massey edited them pretty heavily. She at least gave Finger a lot of guidance about how to make stories for children more effective, using things like alliteration and predictable language. And so they were wildly successful with librarians who had story hours for children, and that's what led to his receiving that award from the ALA.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, from Michael Dugan. Many years ago in Neosho, where Daniel Longwell and his wife retired to, Dan was a founder of Time Life, supervised the Churchill memoirs, and knew everybody in the literary world. Could that have extended to Finger?
I think during the, particularly during the 30s, when Finger was pretty desperate for any kind of freelance work he could get, he made these trips to New York to hustle. And he called on all kinds of publishers, magazines, and a lot of magazines, I think beginning in the 20s, started publishing collections of articles from their pages to basically make more money from the same material that they'd already bought. And so I don't know for a fact, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if they were acquainted.
Okay, and one from Layet Johnson.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Oh, and Layet is our son, and I forgot to thank him at the beginning, but I need to thank him because he helped me round up some of the images that you saw in the slides. Thank you, Layet.
Do any current magazines come to mind that are close to maintaining the tradition of writing and discourse that Finger's work developed?
I don't read The Nation these days, but I would imagine that it is still of that caliber. The New Yorker is the only one that comes to my mind.
And one from Story Matt Conron. She says, thank you, Elizabeth. That was fascinating. I've learned far more from you about Finger than I knew before. Can you share how he had been portrayed before the publication of your biography?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I kind of said, the main legend in Fayetteville was that he was this celebrity writer, and he had this huge circle of celebrity friends who were constantly coming to Guyetta to spend time with him. I think the reality is not quite that rich. He left Fayetteville and went to New York and other places to see all of those friends more than they came to him. But he did cultivate the Fayetteville newspaper from the beginning of living in Fayetteville. He worked hard at having a local image, and he was somewhat politically active. He would come down to Little Rock and give speeches to women's clubs and that kind of thing. He hustled to maintain a public image because he was always looking for that next freelance assignment. So I guess I would say that in the years since he died, it crystallized into that celebrity writer with celebrity friends, and not a lot else known about him.
So definitely not that his sexual identity was not well known then at all.
No, I think there were a handful of people in Fayetteville, good friends he made, who were most, if not all, on the faculty of the university, and they were in the know. But the larger community, absolutely not. I don't think his children were. I think some of his children realized it, and some of them didn't.
Wow. Very interesting. Okay, last call for questions. I don't see anything else.
Well, I sure appreciate everybody who tuned in to listen. And once more, thanks to the Historical Association for having me.
Oh, well, thank you for speaking. We're glad to have you. Again, thank you, Elizabeth Shores. We appreciate you being here. And I hope to see many of you tomorrow night at Ferncliff for the AHA's awards banquet and reception, and a keynote address by Dr. Sharice Jones Branch that promises to be wonderful tomorrow night. And thank you again for watching. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Elizabeth.